The 22nd of June 1941. What kind of nightmare begins at dawn when the earth itself seems to scream? When artillery turns fields into graves and medics run forward into fire, knowing that the wounded will die screaming if they hesitate for even a heartbeat. On that summer morning, Operation Barbarossa exploded across a 1,800-mile front as Nazi Germany launched the largest invasion in human history against the Soviet Union. And while textbooks focus on armored spearheads, encirclements, and maps bleeding red and blue, the real horror and heroism unfolded at ground level, where medics, often unarmed, often nameless, worked under constant fire in a war that shattered every limit of human endurance. Because Barbarossa was not just a military campaign, but a collision of ideologies that unleashed annihilation warfare, racial murder, starvation policies, and medical hell on a scale the world had never seen. And within hours, Luftwaffe bombs smashed Soviet airfields, hospitals, and rail lines, leaving wounded men piled in ditches as frontline medics crawled through wheat fields soaked with blood and fuel, dragging soldiers whose legs were gone, whose faces were burned black, whose screams carried across the steppe louder than the guns. And historically, this chaos was real and documented, because German planners believed the Red Army would collapse in weeks. So medical logistics were thin, evacuation routes were non-existent, and Soviet medics, many barely trained teenagers, were forced to improvise surgeries with bayonets, vodka, and torn uniforms as bandages, while Stuka dive bombers hunted any movement that looked like rescue. And one recorded event from the opening days near Brest Fortress shows medics running repeated dashes across open ground while German machine guns stitched the air. One nurse reportedly returning 5 times for wounded men until shrapnel tore through her back. A moment later remembered by survivors as the field where angels died. And as Barbarossa pushed east through Belarus and Ukraine, the tempo never slowed, because entire armies were encircled at Białystok, Minsk, Smolensk, and later Kyiv, creating oceans of wounded with no rear areas left. And medics found themselves treating thousands in barns, forests, and bombed villages that became impromptu hospitals where the smell of gangrene mixed with smoke and excrement. And horror deepened when Einsatzgruppen followed the advance, executing Jews, Roma, political commissars, and the wounded themselves, forcing medics into impossible moral choices: treat the soldier bleeding out in front of you or try to hide civilians, knowing discovery meant death for everyone. And this is where Barbarossa's hidden cruelty sharpened, because German orders criminalized Soviet medics who aided partisans, while Soviet doctrine demanded medics move forward with assault units, meaning they were often the first into minefields. And near Uman in August 1941, after another massive encirclement, accounts describe medics amputating limbs without anesthesia as artillery walked closer, one man biting down on a leather strap while another screamed prayers, only for a shell to collapse the roof mid-procedure, killing patient and medic alike. And yet, despite this, acts of heroism multiplied, because in the absence of hope, people clung to duty. And during the desperate fighting outside Smolensk, a regimental medic reportedly crossed a river under fire using a floating door as a stretcher, bullets punching holes through the wood while he kept whispering to the unconscious soldier to stay with me, a phrase echoed in countless memoirs. And the campaign's scale magnified everything, because by autumn millions were dead or captured, and winter arrived faster than German planning allowed, turning wounds into death sentences as frostbite blackened fingers and feet. And medics now fought not just bullets but cold so severe that morphine frozen syringes and blood turned to slush before bandages could be tied. And the horror peaked in places like Vyazma and Bryansk, where shattered Soviet units were trapped in forests, medics operating by moonlight while wolves circled, drawn by the smell of death. And later, as the front pushed toward Leningrad and Moscow, the line between battlefield medicine and survival horror vanished. because evacuation meant hauling wounded on sleds under artillery fire, leaving trails of blood in the snow that marked routes for enemy patrols. And German medics were not spared either, as Hitler's fatal gamble stretched supply lines beyond endurance, forcing them to choose who lived and who was left to freeze when trucks failed. And historically documented diaries from both sides reveal the same terror: the sound of a wounded man crying for water at night, the knowledge that lighting a lamp meant instant death from shellfire, and the constant fear that the next scream would be your own. And as Barbarossa failed to deliver quick victory and instead dragged Germany into a war of attrition it could not win, the medics became unwilling witnesses to the collapse of the campaign itself, seeing starvation policies kill civilians by the millions, seeing typhus rip through POW camps where no medicine was allowed by policy, seeing children with burns and shrapnel wounds they were forbidden to treat, and yet still treating them anyway in secret, risking execution, which adds another layer of real heroism often erased from official histories. Because Barbarossa was also a medical catastrophe engineered by ideology. And by the time the Soviet counteroffensive saved Moscow in December 1941, the ground was littered with frozen bodies in poses of agony. Medics among them, some found clutching stretchers. Others discovered with notebooks listing names of men they tried and failed to save. And this human cost is why Operation Barbarossa stands not just as Hitler's fatal strategic gamble, but as a moral abyss where courage and horror coexisted minute by minute. And if you listen closely to survivor testimonies, the common thread is not glory, but endurance. The medic who kept moving despite terror. The nurse who ran toward gunfire. The whispered promise to a dying stranger that he would not be alone. And now ask yourself this, and answer honestly in the comments. If you were that medic on the 22nd of June 1941, crawling through fire with no weapon, no guarantee of survival, and surrounded by screams and death, would you have kept going one step further into hell? Or would fear have finally forced you to stop?